Why did the Mughals fail? First, poor succession practices. And this was an issue with the Mughal Empire even before their decline. The great Mughals, the first six, had to deal with this. Right? As soon as Babur dies in 1530, Humayun immediately has to worry about Kamran, Hindal, and Askari. Right? While Humayun is campaigning against Sher Shah, then Sher Khan, in Bengal, Hindal proclaims himself to be the new emperor. And of course, his issues with Kamran were manifold. Even when they were stuck together in Afghanistan, fighting over Kabul, Humayun was only able to overcome Kamran with Persian support. And this is an issue because in the example that I just cited with Babur's successors, this is a distraction from much greater threats, or and not even necessarily threats, just any issue that the empire should be dealing with is not being dealt with while the sons of the previous emperor are all trying to kill each other. Right? In Humayun's case, while he's fighting his brothers trying to assert his authority, Sher Shah rams a boot up his ass and pushes him out of India, out of Pakistan, and up into Kabul, which eventually he's driven from by Kamran. He has to return with the aid of Tahmasp. That's not great. That's bad for the empire when the empire disappears for 15 years or so because it was too busy fighting itself instead of dealing with an internal threat that came from a movement of disenfranchised members of the previous government that their dad usurped. I mean, come on. It's amateur hour, right? And so that's one example of distracting from greater threats, but it's also a massive resource drain on the empire because, one, just to start, war is a massive resource drain on any empire, on any state. It doesn't have to be an empire. War is the most expensive thing all the time, right? It's such a headache to deal with. And now think about all those resources that get expended, but those resources are all being expended to hurt and damage the state that it's a part of. Think about that, right? And, this can be very obviously seen in the case of Alamgir when he usurped his father and was dealing with the competition against his brothers. He was working with Murad, so he was working against Shah Shuja in Bengal and Dara in the northwest. Right? Dara is able to form a massive army like Alamgir had, and they meet twice. They meet once at Samugar, where Dara is fairly decisively defeated, and they meet again at Diora when Dara is driven from India. And then, of course, he has the Battle of Kwanja, Alamgir does, with Shah Shuja. And Shah Shuja had about 20,000 men in that battle. Alamgir had 60 to 80,000. That is not the kind of... And even there, right, Alamgir has a 3 to 4 to 1 advantage in terms of men. But still, 20,000 men can do a lot of damage, and did do a lot of damage at the Battle of Kwanja, to 80,000 men, an army. And of course, not to mention all the infrastructure damage that's going to be caused by the use of heavy cannon, by raiding an enemy prince's territory. And now, you may think to the Mughals and their kind of gunpowder counterpart in the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans not only had this similar system of succession, it was codified in law. And then you may think, well, why is it so damaging for the Mughals but not a problem for the Ottomans? It's because the Ottomans can race to Constantinople. And before they could do that, it was immensely damaging to the empire to have a civil war. Think of the Ottoman interregnum, right? For 8 years, the Ottomans were at war with each other, and they lost a bunch of vassals in Anatolia. They lost a bunch of vassals in the Balkans. And the Ottomans were able to overcome this via a race to Constantinople. Right? The sons of the previous sultan were all stationed in provinces they could get experience, like the Mughals did. And they would all race to Constantinople and try to take command of the central administration and take command of the professional standing army of the Janissaries. Right? There is no equivalent of this in India. There was, to a degree, a race to Delhi, but all that guaranteed was that you had more resources, you had more money, because you had the coffers of Delhi to bring to bear against your princely rival. And that was by no means a guarantee of victory, like having those resources plus a Janissary corps would be, right? Because Dara got the Delhi before Alamgir did, and Dara was defeated. And even before the actual princely competition, Shah Jahan sent Jai Singh down, and he was defeated at Darmat by Alamgir. And of course, he had the full backing of the Mughal state. And so resources alone is not enough. You need to have the professional army. And the Mughals did not have a professional army. They used the Mansab system, right? Each individual, Mansab holder was required to fight for the emperor and provide some soldiers to fight for the emperor, plus, whatever irregular levies that you can put a gun in some random Jat peasant's hands and say, all right, let's go, right? Well, any prince can do that from their region, right? If you're the Prince of Bengal, like Shah Shuja was, you can collect all the Mansab holders in Bengal and say, we're going after Alamgir, and then you can recruit plenty of Bengali peasants to give them guns and say, let's go after Alamgir. And Alamgir did the same thing in the Deccan, and Dara did the same thing in the Northwest. And so it's a lot more equal, which means there's a lot more destruction to be brought to India itself. Next, we have the decline of central authority in the empire. This, again, had always, to a degree, been an issue, but it's really bad once we get to the post-Alamgir years. Part of this is that the Mughals were never all that interested in infrastructure, right? The Mughals never were really big builders of roads in the same way that the Sure dynasty was. They were never big investors in infrastructure, and to a degree, that's very hard to do in India because of the kind of floodplains that exist there. But still, no attempt, very few bridges built, any of that stuff, right? And so that means that it takes a lot longer for you, if you're the emperor, to deal with a governor that's being recalcitrant, because he has way more time to focus his forces and gather his things, and you have to spend so much more time coming to get him that he can really entrench, and he can cause a lot of issues for you. And so a lot of emperors would decide, he can do that if he really wants. I'm not going to press the issue. I'm not going to force him to remit more taxes to me. I'm not going to force him to enforce this firman that I have just issued. Right? And again, no professional military that is loyal specifically to you, right? As the emperor, as the Mughal emperor. You can't have, you have no janissaries, you have no gulams that you can just collect that are loyal specifically to you and set them against an enemy province. And theoretically, it's not as big of a deal because you have the resources of the entire empire versus one recalcitrant province. But still, how are you going to organize all of those different, very, very separate provinces to raise up arms for you and transport this massive army to whatever province you're going after? It's just not practical. Theoretically, it's possible and would discourage revolt, but it's just not practical. And again, with the Mansab system, same with no professional military, right? He can just recruit whatever Mansabs. If you're a governor, if you say you're the governor of Bengal, right? You can just recruit the Mansabs. You could say, Mansabs, right? I'm increasing the revenues that you're getting. I'm increasing your land. I'm increasing your Mansab. If you fight for me, done. They're your soldiers now. And finally, the Mughal court is itinerant, right? Largely itinerant. They get this from their Central Asian ancestors, right? They have a capital in Delhi, and they are there. But largely, the Mughal emperor is going to be going, he's either just going to be traveling around touring his empire like Jahangir did, or he's going to be attending to or very close near to any military campaign that's going on, right? Alamgir was always with his army. Babur was always with his army. Humayun, same thing. Akbar had multiple fronts going on at once, but he was always at least on one of them. And Shah Jahan was never led armies from the front, at least when he was the Shah. But he always made sure to move himself closer so that he could observe and see what needed to be done. Right? Well, if the authority of the emperor is the capital, right? The capital goes wherever the emperor is. The further away you are from the emperor, who is moving around the empire constantly, the further you are away from his authority. And so you can really spend a lot of time building up a power base that is loyal specifically to you. That's another thing, right? Again, besides Delhi, there aren't that many power bases that exist in India for the Mughals that they can go to or have forces stationed in that could immediately put down a revolt outside of them. Everything has to have their say-so, and they're all around the empire all the time, and communication is so slow because they have terrible infrastructure. It's real bad news, right? And there are stories of, Alamgir, who was being petitioned by an old woman because her property was being unjustly confiscated by a governor. Alamgir ruled in her favor and then told her, I can't enforce it because I'm running around fighting the Marathas. And you are all the way up in the north. So I can't enforce this even though these people are my governors who are doing this to you. They won't listen to me. And this is Alamgir. He's supposed to be the most powerful Mughal emperor. Who's going to listen to Jahandar? Who's going to listen to Alamgir II? Nobody. Right, and I have examples of this here, my pictures. Asaf Jah on the far right, who of course eventually does break off and starts the Hyderabad state in the Deccan, and then Aliverdi Khan, who ceases to send taxes to the Mughal emperor from Bengal and rules it independently. And in both of those cases, Bengal was better off with the Mughals. And Asaf Jah and the Asaf Jahids were better at ruling, at least initially, the Hyderabad state than the Mughals were. Because, and this bleeds into our third problem here, overextension. This is largely caused by the pushing of the Deccan. Come on, everybody knows this, right? I'm sorry if you're a Hindu. I know seeing Aurangzeb's face might make you, drive you into conniptions, but there he is, right? And he's the one who's primarily responsible for this, right? I mean, look at all that expansion. I mean, good lord. And so, the Mughals push into the Deccan. This starts during the reign of Akbar. He's pushing against the Ahmadnagar Sultanate. Gets really bad during the reign of Shah Jahan, who is coming at Bijapur, initially vassalizing Bijapur, and then conquering it, making Alamgir governor there. And then, of course, Alamgir conquers Golconda and stirs up the nest with the Marathas and is bogged down in the Deccan until the day he dies. And so, large parts of the Mughal army are stuck in the Deccan, fighting constantly. But there are other problems in other places in the empire, right? For example, Alamgir, while he's fighting in the Deccan, also has to deal with the revolt of the Rajputs, which largely is his fault, but the revolt of the Rajputs, right? Well, you're stuck in the Deccan, your forces are stuck in the Deccan, what do? You just let them run amok, right? The army can't be there to put out all the fires at once. And again, this bleeds into the vassal policy and the conflict with the former allies, right? The Mughals initially, especially Babur, because he was a Central Asian leader, was fairly tributary to a large degree. They like to have vassals that kind of performed a cushion between them and the outside world, right? Think the Rajputs initially during the reign of Akbar, right? He wants Rajput princesses to marry into his harem. And all you have to do, in exchange, if you are a Rajput Raja, is you send some soldiers, right? You say the Lord of Jodhpur, you send some soldiers, you send some money, and you're going to like this, right? This is a good deal for you, even though you're a vassal, because one, none of your local rivals can mess with you anymore because you're the backing of the Mughal state, right? And of course, if both of you are backed by the Mughal state, like Jodhpur and Jaipur, say, why are you going to fight each other? The Mughals are going to put a stop to that and broker some kind of peace. But also, the Mughals loved putting vassals in charge of the military, right? Again, think Jai Singh. He was a Rajput prince. Jaswant Singh, another Rajput prince. And so they're very, very careful to include their vassals. And why would you want vassals? It's exactly so you don't get overextended, right? Because think about the Mughal Empire. If you are a Maratha raider, right? If you're Baji Rao, why do you want to push into the Mughal Empire? One, it's huge. There's a lot of stuff to steal. Two, it's huge and it's rich, right? And it's huge. Again, the army can't be everywhere at once because it's so big. So you can push in and you can steal, right? There's just too much border to cover. Not the case if you have a vassal, right? If they say vassalized Golconda and Bijapur, it would be Bijapur, who would be dealing with the Maratha raids. Right? There's no way they'd be able to cross all that territory up into the, at least not at that time. They weren't powerful enough to do that yet. They would be eventually. But they wouldn't be able to cross the entire, Bijapur Sultan to go out to the Mughals if they kept Bijapur as a vassal. And that also works for the vassal, too, because the vassal doesn't have to worry about defending all that area. They can just look south and deal with the Marathas there. And, of course, there's less incentive because Bijapur is smaller and not as wealthy as the Mughal Empire. But they abandoned this policy. Alamgir is a war hawk. He likes annexing things. He thinks, I'm going to be big and manly by expanding my empire. And, again, talking about war drains the treasury, right? There were massive famines wherever Alamgir went because his troops, he had this giant army, right? All his troops needed food, and they ate food, and they ended up causing famines, which kills farmers, which leads to less resources being produced in the future because the farmers are dead. And there's less revenues to be had because nobody's farming because they're dead. And this leads to a loss of revenues, which means the military can't be paid, which means the military is even less likely, and this is something the Mughals were notorious for. Pay was always in arrears, even during the reign of Alamgir, but especially during the reign of the later Mughals. Right? But if the army can't be paid, why would you do anything for the emperor if he's not giving you any money? Right? Because there's no kind of like professional or patriotic buildup like there would be in the 18th century, the 19th century. You're just some peasant that Alamgir has impressed, or Jahandar has impressed into his army. He's put a gun in your hand and he said, here's no money, die for me. Why would you do that? That's why Mughal discipline was so bad. I'd run away too if I wasn't being paid. And I was just some random regular soldier who nobody ever explained to me why I should be part of the Mughal Empire. That's ridiculous, right? Of course their morale was terrible. And then finally, along with the issue with famines leading to less production in the future, if you are, say, a Jat peasant, and you get constantly raided by the Marathas, your farmlands are going to be in ruins. You're not going to have any money to repair them. And even if you do, what you're going to have is going to get stolen. That's what you do. You become a bandit. It's easy. But then there's less land to get revenues from because it's not being cultivated. It's called anchoresis. It's a whole thing. That happened a lot in Ptolemaic Egypt as well, but kind of getting off track there. Right? But then now that you're a bandit and you're raiding further north, right, because you're not a Maratha, but you're on this bandit and you're raiding your neighbors who are further north, they're going to have the same problem you did. And they're also going to resort to banditry. And so on and so forth. So the empire has gotten bigger and it's made less money. And this is not at all helped by Alamgir's, and to a lesser extent Shah Jahan's, endorsement of total warfare, where you're just destroying all the fields you can find, running in, sacking cities, destroying, of course, Hindu temples. Alamgir loved doing that. Right? You are, one, building the hatred of the populace, which is probably going to make them more likely to resort to banditry, to screw with you. And then also, you're destroying anything that makes the land that you've now adding to your empire profitable. It's just foolish. And you can see in Alamgir's letters to Shah Jahan, near the end, right before Alamgir usurps him, that Shah Jahan is yelling at him, saying, why am I, these are deficit provinces, and he's saying, they're deficit provinces because I've destroyed everything like you told me to conquer it. Right, so, and this is probably the biggest one, overextension is what I would say, is overextension is the biggest issue with the Mughals, and that's what leads to a lot of all the other problems. Especially, right, of course, if you're overextended, you have even more territory, it's going to be harder to centralize your authority. And overextension, there's more provinces for Mughal princes to extract revenues from and fight each other with. So, and then of course that's going to destroy the empire even more and make it have less money. And they're not going to be able to pay the military. It's ridiculous. Alright, so next we have the loss of absolute autocracy. Right? And what do I mean by that? Right, because we already talked about kind of the decentralization of the empire with Alvari Khan being able to split off, Asaf Jah being able to split off, even if they're technically still parts of the empire. They don't pay taxes, they don't do any of that. Right? And this is in the court itself. The emperor, even though he's in the court with, all these other courtiers, he's not the one who holds absolute control, or at least he has to split control with other people. Right on the right, we have Zulfikar Khan. He's kind of the first person to really be a executor of this kind of style of rule in the Mughal Empire, where you have somebody who's a power behind the throne. And Zulfikar Khan comes to this position by aiding Jahandar to become the next Shah after the death of Muazzam or Bahadur Shah I, who came after Alamgir. So Jahandar is the 8th Mughal emperor, right? And Zulfikar Khan was able to extract concessions, and other aristocrats later on, like the Sayyid brothers, would be able to extract concessions from potential emperors who wanted to become emperor, right, and defeat their brothers. Well, in exchange for, your support as Zulfikar Khan, I'll give you, your mansab. Say that becomes a fief, right? And not saying that this happened, but that's just an example, right? And then when you have people who are in power like this, right, with a monarch, especially an absolute monarch, he is the state, right? And so he can't really be bribed because he already, especially with the Mughals, already pretty much owns all the wealth in the state. You can be bribed, somebody who's a power behind the throne, right? They can use the levers of state to aid their family, which is exactly what Zulfikar Khan did. He was notorious for his corruption. Sometimes you get lucky with people like Ashab Jah, who do have the state's best interest in mind, but still, how did that go? Eventually, Ashab Jah quit, went to the Deccan, right? And also, not even is it extracting concessions from certain princes. Think about just if you are a noble who wants to increase their power in the Mughal court, and there's a succession struggle, which prince are you going to pick? Are you going to pick somebody who's a real forceful personality, strong military leader, competent? No, you're going to pick somebody who's a dummy. You're going to pick a moron, right? Jahandar, right? Giant drunk. And so you're able to pick somebody who's pliable, easy to control. They're not going to do a good job ruling the country. And of course, that's going to hurt the country, right? And this is a system that we see, right? Jahandar is very much the first, but then we see Rafi ad Dawla and Rafi ad Darjat, who are both massive opium addicts. Muhammad Rangila, right, who's in the bottom left there. Absolute coward. Terrible performance as emperor, right, in the Karnal, right? When he was being picked during the usurpation of the Sayyid brothers, they came in and he was hiding under one of the Begum's skirts. Is that the kind of guy who you want to be running your country? No. But he did, because he let the Sayyid brothers do whatever they want, and then he let Safdar Jung do whatever he wanted, right? And Kandaran and all those people. So there you go. And finally, we have the court purges that come after every succession crisis now, right? Because beforehand, and usually they try to bring in their own men, the new emperors, right? Jahangir brought in new men compared to Akbar and Shah Jahan to Jahangir, and so on and so forth. But those new men they're bringing in, they're not killing the old ones. The old ones are still valued members of the court. Not anymore, right? Think about what happened, the ultimate end of Zulfikar Khan, right? He was killed by the Sayyid brothers. He was killed by Farrukhsiyar for supporting Jahandar against his father, Asid. And so we have a lot of very, very capable potential courtiers who are being murdered for their support of the wrong candidate. So this just the loss of absolute autocracy leads to just a giant tank in the competence of government and the government's ability to work for the people of India. Next, we have the most kind of readily apparent foreign invasion, right? And again, think about the Marathas, who certainly do a lot of damage to the economy of the Mughal Empire. But the Marathas aren't huge on taking territory, right? They like to have their directly administrated territory, like to have a cushion of vassals like the old Mughals did. And then anywhere that's not in that cushion, you go and you raid, right? And maybe they pay you the chow, maybe they don't, you get to keep raiding. But they're not super interested in seizing territory. This is unlike the later rulers, right? Like Nadir Shah, who of course is a great admirer of Timur, wants to create this vast Iranian empire, right? When he comes into the empire, in the Mughals, he crushes them, right? He defeats Zakaria Khan at the Khyber Pass and just cleaves off a lot of the northern part of the empire. Pretty much all of Afghanistan is gone. Large parts of Pakistan are gone, at least the most profitable parts, right? And of course, he is the first person to sack Delhi. And this is a huge thing, right? I have written there, first sack of Delhi since 1398. So in 400 years, This is the first sack of Delhi. And if you are somebody who was in the vicinity of India, you're a foreign state, and you look and you see, for the first time in 400 years, the capital has been sacked. Mughals start to look pretty weak now, don't they? Look like easy pickings. So maybe you do what Nadir does. That's exactly what happens, right? Of course, we have the horrible, horrific invasions of Durrani, who, of course, was a general for Nadir Shah, who comes in and, especially with a religious motive, right, is paying his soldiers to just murder peasants for the crime of being a Hindu, though, of course, plenty of Muslims were affected horribly by Durrani's attacks, too. And then he's coming in and just raising, he raises Mathura, of course, pushing very far into South India, until he leaves, having raided India, 4 or 5 times. The cash cow is all dried up. And India has lost a lot of money to Durrani, and its lands have been further destroyed than they already were, and now they can't even afford to, recover. And of course, particularly with Durrani, he appoints rulers in the Mughal Empire, right? He deposed Ahmad al-Mulk, and eventually that led to the, dictatorship of Najib Khan, who was working for Durrani, and of course, and then you have Zabida Khan and Ghulam Qadir, who stay important members of the Mughal court even after Durrani is long dead, through the reign of Shah Alam, right? And of course, once the British take over, you also have people, like Thomas Metcalfe, who are basically just watching the Mughals, what little of them is left, to make sure they don't get out of line, right? You can't give somebody a kill ad, God forbid, right? And then, of course, just a little poke about the British, because we had the first two, right? We had the Persians, we have the Afghans, and the British, right? They take Bengal. That's a huge cash province, right? The amount of textiles, right? The industry in Bengal, it's gone. You lose all that money. And I'm kind of bleeding into some other points, so I'm not going to talk about that too much, right? But you see, right? And Axworthy has argued that the EIC taking Bengal and pursuing a more aggressive posture against the Mughals was because they saw Nadir Shah sack Delhi with ease, right? He annihilated them at the Karnal, right? And the Karnal is really just, you can see the decrepitness of the Mughal army. I talked about this a little bit, right? Not really your individual Mughal soldier's fault for not having any morale. He's not getting paid. He's been impressed. They put a gun in his hands, and the emperor, who has done nothing for you, decides to take your money, is now saying, die for me too. Of course you're going to run away. But that wasn't even what really happened at Karnal, right? Because Sadat Khan got baited by the Kizilbash. They did a feigned retreat after raiding his baggage train. He followed them, and they opened up, and there were a bunch of, camel-mounted cannons that shot him out. And then Khan Duran follows him, trying to save him, and he falls victim to the same thing. Very similar to the Battle of Varna in that, with the left wing, Cesarini and the other bishop there. But again, getting off track. But yeah, and so foreign invasion, of course, obviously, you're losing money, parts of the state are being destroyed or cleaved off, and then, of course, with the British and with Durrani, they're even messing with your internal politics, right? So obviously, this is a very horrible thing that the Mughal Empire is going through. That's going to be a major contributor to its downfall. And right, I've already talked about this a little bit. I got a little ahead of myself, got a little excited. We have economic decline. Okay, of course, talking about the Maratha raids and the process of Angkor and the loss of security to banditry pipeline, right? All of this stuff, right? Losing Bengal, the textiles that came from there, losing parts of northern Pakistan that were heavily urbanized to Nadir Shah, and then especially later Durrani, and also, urbanized areas just being totally razed in central and southern India, like with Durrani destroying Mathura, which is, again, Mathura was a big center of pilgrimage. That's a way to make money. Not anymore, because the city's razed by the Afghans. Right? And so you're losing industrial centers. And again, and the Mughals, because they are already so behind, they can't even afford to pay their army, which is the most basic function of state. They cannot possibly adapt, right? They cannot possibly get in on a steam engine, get in on mercantilism, right? It's just impossible for them, right? I wrote ignored, because that was the best word I can think of it in written form. It's not really their fault. It's not like they're actively shutting their eyes to the Western world. They tried their very best, right? Shah Alam was a very forward-thinking guy. Of course, the earlier Mughals like Akbar, Jahangir were very forward-thinking and keen on learning, the advances that Europe had seen. but it was just impossible for them to do it, right? They didn't have the funds, they didn't have the resources, and of course, if you're, Britain, say the EIC, why would you teach them, these kind of modern military techniques? Because they're going to use them against you, because you want to conquer India. And then finally, right, dependent on foreign pensions, right? Things were so bad that, this is the kind of the final blow, and not necessarily the final blow, but this is the final blow to Mughal sovereignty. It's not necessarily the dynasty itself, when Lord Lake and the EIC becomes the protector of Shah Alam. Right? He was so desperate for money. Delhi was annihilated after Ghulam Qadir and his nonsense and his drunken carousing, destroying the city because he's a dickhead. Right? That drunk Afghan. Ugh, can't stand Ghulam Qadir. Anyway, right? Northern India is ruined. Delhi itself is ruined. The Marathas are now actually being able to, because they are modernizing, because they have the resources to modernize with Benwar to Boyne, the Marathas are snagging more territory. But even then, right, Mahaji Sindhya is dead, and Mahaji Sindhya was the one who was really interested in dealing with Shah Alam and having him as a symbol of legitimacy across India. Daulat, not nearly that smart. All right, I don't hate Daulat, but Daulat is not nearly as competent as his dad, right? And Daulat really neglects that, and Lord Lake is able to sneak in and say, we're going to increase the pension for you and your family, we're going to help you rebuild Delhi. And in the Golden Calm, you do see that, to a degree, that did happen, right? A lot of poetry. Zafar, very, very wonderful court, Ghalib and his rival. And so, but of course, depending on the foreign pension, and with the Marathas, it's not quite the same, because again, the Marathas are a lot less hands-on than the British are. So you can still kind of run your empire how you want to, even if technically you don't have that sovereignty, because the Marathas are pretty chill, right? British, not so much. And of course, the British are also much better at securing power bases close to Delhi than the Marathas were. The Marathas were very, Deccan-based and didn't really want to leave that. And then, of course, we're just going to get into a little bit of a seaport rebellion here, just because, I want to establish the absolute fall of the dynasty in 1857, 1858, right? And so, right, all this has happened. The Mughals are just stuck, right? There's, to a degree, a bit of a cultural renaissance, Perso-Islamic, Indo-Islamic, great stuff culturally, right? A lot of pretty poetry, maybe some pretty buildings, some parades, fireworks, all that stuff, right? Zafar, famous poet himself, let alone a lot of other poets who were being patronized. But, right, Seaport Rebellion starts in Meerut. Also, you have Mangal Pandey. And, of course, they proclaim the emperor, right? They proclaim the emperor as a warrior against England, even though Zafar was not really a huge fan of those sepoys because they were kind of ruining a city. And also, he was against, on May 16th, 1857, when they murdered all those English women and children. So he wasn't a fan of the sepoys, and the sepoys were quite rapacious. But he gives his blessing, right? And that leads to a jihad. Right, you have Bakht Khan and Sarfaraz Ali coming down from northern Pakistan and Afghanistan, coming in to help. Of course, they don't help. They end up just causing a lot of tension in the city between the sepoys and, of course, the jihadis, like the military figures, and also just regular Hindus and Muslims who live in the city. But, of course, eventually, the final assault on Delhi, Zafar is surrendered. The three main princes who kind of led the rebellion, right? Khizr Khan, of course, Mirza Mughal, and Abu Bakr are all shot in the head, summary executed. The British talking about, oh my god, the Mughals are so despotic, oriental, desperate, and then they summarily execute a bunch of people. Come on. And there we have it, right? That's the end. The British come in, all these factors coalesce, make the Mughals weak. There's one final, go out with a bang under Zafar, and then the Raj is ushered in. And of course, those guys, they're not so great at running India either. As always, we have my sources here, and this is a lot less academic than my first video. These are mostly like narrative histories that I've read, and I just wanted to kind of take some things that I thought about them and try to make a more academic argument based on them. Unfortunately, right, I'm some white dude who lives in Illinois, so I don't speak Hindi, I don't speak Persian, I can't get my hands on the primary sources. So yeah, we got a lot of secondary sources. But of course, Abraham Elliot, William Delver, people like this, these are very good historians, very well renowned. So, see you in the next one.